It's always great to be here. I love your pastor. He's been a good friend of mine for a long time. You are blessed to be in a church like this where you have a pastor that will speak Genesis to Revelation, the whole book, unashamedly and boldly, because he knows that's the greatest way we can love our neighbor. How many of you have started to attend this church in the last 2 years? A lot. Okay, great. The last time I was here was 2 years ago. Yes, I'm glad you're here. This is the right place to be. How many of you have gotten saved in the last 2 years? Any new believers? Okay, I see some hands. Good, good. Well, I encourage those that have recently gotten saved, and also if you've been saved a long time, make sure you're plugging in to all the resources here at this church to help you grow and mature. Because as you grow and become more mature in your faith, it gives you the boldness and the courage to speak the truth because you know you have the answers for the world today. It's not a question, you know you have that. And then you want to share that because you love your neighbor, so you need to tell them about Jesus. But I want to encourage you in that. God kind of called me into from childhood, I think back to my parents and everything, their actions back in the 60s and things, but into studying the communist movement worldwide many decades ago, into exposing that. And it's kind of a different thing that he's given me to do, but I realize it's a key part of the puzzle. In Ephesians 6, it tells us that we are in a spiritual battle. This is a real battle. It's not fictitious, but a lot of it we cannot see. Our earthly eyes cannot see the war raging around us, but it is real. We see it through things happening in our culture, like the transgender movement and things. When you see a culture encouraging children to mutilate themselves, you realize something's going on here. Well, I'm telling you, it's this spiritual battle, and it talks about it there in Ephesians 6, and here's what it says. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that ye may be able to stand against the wiles, the tricks of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. If I were to ask you about Jesus' disciples, I know you would say, oh, he had 12 disciples, and once he died on the cross and was resurrected from the dead and then ascended up into heaven, those 12 disciples spent their life sharing the good news, preaching the gospel throughout the world. And what does the Bible tell us happened because of their hard work? The world was turned upside down. When that truth finally got to the peoples of the world, that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. He had come to die on that cross for them personally because they had broken his laws. They deserved judgment. And he said, no, I love them. I will pay the penalty, the perfect lamb, and I'm going to shed my blood so their sins can be forgiven. Well, that message transformed the world, and it still is doing that today. But what's interesting is we see that, and then today we realize we are his followers, right? Hopefully most of you are Christians. We are his followers. What's our job? It's to glorify him in everything that we do. It's to keep his commandments. It's to be an example to the world, to do things the way he intended them to be done so the world can see what a family is supposed to look like, where they can see what a church is supposed to look like. They can see how a community is supposed to operate. If you're a businessman, they can see how a business is supposed to operate. If every Christian is living this out in every area of their life, then the world gets to see, you're doing things differently. And you can say, I sure am. Do you know why? And then we can tell them of Jesus. Why? That's why I'm loving my neighbor. That's why I do fair business dealings. It's all about him. That's what he commanded us to do, and so I'm just trying to do that in my life. And when each of us does that, that light is so bright in this dark world, no one can deny it. It's so real and there. So we know those things, but I think a lot of us have been naive to not understand, yes, God has his disciples and followers, but so does Satan. It's not like he doesn't have people that are totally committed to his cause. What's his cause? Turning everything on its head, destroying everything and turning it away from the way God intended it to be, to the opposite of that, to destroy. He loves to steal, to kill, and destroy. And as I've studied the communist movement for decades now, I realized they are his disciples. They are the ones that are following him, whether they know it or not. And they are the ones tearing apart the family, tearing apart the communities, tearing apart every structure God put in place to be a blessing to us, to hold us up and to protect us when we're young and to encourage us and all those things. That's what they've been about. And I realized, oh my goodness. And as I studied them, I'm just telling you this, they're more committed than we are. That's why we're losing. That's why what has happened to our country has happened. I'll talk more about that at the end to encourage you. They are more committed to their lie a lot of times than we are the truth. And we can't let that be the case because it's so vital what's going on. What I'm going to talk about this morning is the Marxist communist attack on Christianity. They have been working diligently for over 100 years in this country, again, to just destroy, to fracture, and we have been asleep at the wheel most of the time, and that's why they've been so successful in what they have done. There was a book written in 1952 called Witness, and it was by a man named Whittaker Chambers. And that book is an incredible book, but he was a communist spy working in Washington, D.C. back in the 1930s. And do you know how God got a hold of him? He became a Christian and everything. One morning, he was eating breakfast with his daughter, and he said, as I was watching her eat her porridge, I noticed the design of her ear, and I realized there has to be a creator. Isn't that amazing how God gets a hold of different people? He's a hardcore communist, undercover in the communist cells in Washington, D.C., and he sees that. And he said, I tried to throw that thought out of my mind because communism said, no, there is no God. We are God. We will be as gods. And anyway, but in that book, it's an incredible book. It's his story of coming out of the Communist Party, and he became a Christian. But he summarized it all down, having been embedded in that side and believing in the communist cause, and then all of a sudden realizing it's a lie and realizing God is the truth and Jesus Christ. He said the whole battle is very simple. We complicate it. It's simply this. It's either God or man. That's it. That's the battle. It's either God, who is Jesus Christ and the biblical principles, or it's man. And if you follow Jesus Christ and obey biblical principles, you're blessed. You have the instruction manual to know how everything is supposed to operate and work. And if you follow it like America did for a couple hundred years, you're so blessed. You look like a miracle to the world because how did you guys do that? It's because we tried to do things God's way, and he blessed it. But I'm telling you this, as I've studied history and everything, then there's man's way. And no matter the 1,000 different varieties of man's way, they always end in communism. That's the final destination. When you throw God out of a society, you throw him, he's not welcome. You don't want his principles. You don't want his morality. You don't want his structures. You don't want anything that he designed to be there to protect. It will end in communism every single time. And so that's why this battle is so significant. You know, it's either God and the Christian culture it creates, which is morality, it's free, it's righteousness, or it's the secular condition of man, and that always ends in immorality, which always leads to slavery. And that's the choice today. It's something that, again, is why we need to understand the enemy. As I've studied communism, here's a couple things about them that are important to understand. One is they always tell you where they are going. My documentary films, if you've seen them, it's me simply going back and studying what were they saying in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s, and then studying that and then looking where we have come and go, wow, they did it. They obviously did it because all the goals they had on their agenda, they've checked them off. And that's why America has so changed. So they tell you where they're going, but number two, they always state their purpose as the opposite of what it is. It's a deceptive lie. One of the groups I studied as I was studying communism, and it's a perfect example of this, it's a communist organization out of Chicago, and it's called the Committee to Defend the Bill of Rights. Isn't that amazing? I was studying them, like, started by communists, funded by communists. I wonder how many conservatives have written them a check. Oh, Committee to Defend the Bill of, oh yeah, that sounds good. But who is Satan? He's the father of lies. See, it's always going to be a deception. It's always going to be a half-truth. It's always going to be wickedness. Number 3, they always accuse you of doing what they are actually doing. So, if they accuse us, you're trying to destroy our democracy or whatever, we don't have a democracy, but if they say that to us because that's what they're doing. Or you're a racist, it's because they're racist. It's always the opposite, and it's a very effective tactic to silence people because people don't want to be called a racist or someone that's destroying our country. This battle, too, is something that a lot of people woke up to in our country a long time ago, back in the 1950s. And many are just awakening today to see this, but this has been going on a long time. I'm going to read just a couple sentences. This is from Time magazine, so not some radical conservative thing or anything. 1955, America. Here's Time magazine talking about this. The conflict between communism and freedom is the problem of our time. It overshadows all other problems. This conflict mirrors our age, its toils, its tensions, its trouble, and its task. On the outcome of this conflict depends the future of all mankind. Isn't that sobering? 75 years ago, they realized this is a serious threat. This is destroying our country. Most people were just, what are you talking about? Everything's going to be fine. And so they were able to continue to gain influence, to gain position slowly behind the scenes. And I'll talk about some of the things that they did here. Excuse me. A lot of people are using the word Marxism today, which is good, but they're kind of using it in place of communism as if, well, communism is not really around anymore. Now it's Marxist. But I want to tell you very clearly that Marxists are communists. When you believe the Marxist philosophies, when you seek to implement them, you create a communist society. And so it's the same thing. Don't be deceived by it. Vladimir Lenin, who was the founder of the Soviet Union, he told us what Marxism is. He was a genius of strategy. Almost everything the left has done over the last 100 years is straight out of his playbook. How you manipulate other people to go along with whatever you're doing and use their energies, convince them you're with them, but use them as long as you can for as much ground as you can gain. But here's him talking about it. Here's what he said. Carefully, attentively, and skillfully take advantage of every, even the smallest fissure among the enemy. Seize every, even the smallest opportunity of gaining a mass ally. So you're looking for anyone you can work with to get more ground. Even though this ally be temporary, vacillating, unstable, unreliable, and conditional. Those who do not understand this fail to understand even a grain of Marxism. What is Marxism? It's using everyone and everything to your advantage. Even if it's unreliable, whoever it is. A perfect example of that is how they are using the Christian church today. They realize, boy, there's a lot of energy in the church. If we can package what we're trying to sell the world in the radical environmental movement, if we can call it creation care and throw a few Bible verses in here, these idiots will, oh, really? Yeah, creation, we're supposed to be for that. And they'll jump in not realizing we're using their energies not to help the planet or help the environmental issues, but to push a radical agenda that's going to give us more power and more control. That's all it's ever about. It's like I said earlier, it's never about what they say it's about. It's the opposite of that. And so we have to be very careful. They also, as you study the movement and the cause, They always have had a plan, very well articulated and written down. I think that's why they've been so successful. They've, at different times, in 1904, Vladimir Lenin wrote a book called What Must Be Done. And it laid out, if we want a communist world, and that was before any communist countries, here's what we need to do. And then just a few years later, in 1917, the people who had read his book joined with him to have a communist Bolshevik revolution in Russia and took over Russia. And so in 1932, William Z. Foster, who was head of the Communist Party USA in America, he wrote a book called Towards Soviet America. And in there he outlined, if we want to turn America into the Soviet Union, here's what we need to do. So every fellow traveler back then would read that book and know, okay, here's what we need to do. And he had a whole section on the schools, on getting into the schools, getting into Hollywood, getting into the media, getting into the seminaries to take over the church. And so they all knew. And so, but here's their ultimate goal. And I think a lot of people, because the Soviet Union dissolved and we thought, oh, communism's over, even though Red China's still there and there's a lot of communist countries still in the world. But here's their ultimate goal. And it doesn't change. I've learned one thing. They're so committed. They don't care if it takes 100 years more or what. They will work until they get what they want, which is world communism. But here's what Vladimir Lenin said in 1920. This is the game plan they're all marching to. Quote, first we will take Eastern Europe, then the masses of Asia. We will encircle the last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We will not need to fight. It will fall as a ripe fruit into our hands. It's amazing to me. He knew in 1920, when it finally came to America, they were going to so have rotted us from the inside out, our morality, that we would just collapse. They wouldn't have to fire a shot. They would, we would just fall. And we kind of see we're in that process right now. And it's been carefully premeditated, all the things that have happened. It was Satan and his disciples carefully breaking down all the protections that God had put there to bless and protect mankind. And that's what happened. So many of the movements, and again, Satan is the father of lies. The Bible tells us there is no truth in him. So you realize, okay, all that they're presenting, it's shiny, it's glittery, but it's not gold. It's like in Proverbs, it says, there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. That's God clearly telling us, you can be on a path that seems right, but it is not right. It's a warning to us. Well, they can make whatever path they're trying to sell you seem right. So if you are not wise, if you're not in your Bible and understanding the times and being fed and growing, you're going to be deceived by their lies because they're masters of telling lies. One of the just going through a few of the movements to show how they've done what they've done. A few summers ago, the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay, it sounds good. So, which of course, everything they sell, it sounds great. Like, oh, yeah, they do matter. How can I get involved? But I knew when I first heard of that group back in about 2015, when it first started, I was studying these things. I said, okay. I looked up who started it, and it's two people that say we are trained Marxist organizers. You can go to their website right now, and they still have that video on there. So they're not ashamed that they have a communist flag on the wall behind them. And so I go, okay, it's communist. So if they're saying Black Lives Matter, what do they really mean? And I knew right then, that means black lives don't mean anything at all. This is going to be a movement to use the black community to create the chaos we want to get more power and control. And sure enough, a few years later, all of a sudden it started to stir up. What did those Marxist organizers do? They came into black communities, stirred up the young black kids, and got them to burn down the businesses that they could have gotten a job in, or they could buy things, burn down their own neighborhoods. The organizers didn't get arrested. They slipped out in the night, and the kids were arrested. It wasn't about helping black people. It was about using black people. And we have to always see that. That's why we have to be discerning and understand the time so we can warn people. No, I know that sounds good, but it is not good. And it ends in death. And we have to protect our brothers and sisters in that community, in that particular case. Here's one quote from Lenin talking about how you do this. Again, this is from 110 years ago. Listen to him. Socialists must explain to the masses that they have no other road of salvation except the revolutionary overthrow of their government, and that advantage must be taken of these governments' embarrassments in the present war precisely for that purpose. So you have that George Floyd thing, and Marxist knows, oh, we got any embarrassment, anything that happens that's not good, we're going to use it. We're jumping in and we're using that for all it's worth, but it's not going to be to solve that problem or anything. It's going to be to create the chaos we love and destroy what is left. Another key movement that we're all prone to be sucked into because we really do care is about the environmental movement. Everyone cares about the environment. We all want clean air, clean water, and we want to steward our resources. But if you dig into that too, you see it's all just a Marxist lie. The whole thing, the way that they've structured it. I dug back in and found out, where did this start from? And it was shocking to me when I found it. It started, the modern environmental movement started in 1883 by a man named Karl Marx. The last paper he wrote before he died that year was called Dialectics of Nature. And he said, we're going to use the environment to claim that businesses are creating pollution and we're all going to die because of it. It's going to cloud out the sun. We're not going to be able to grow crops. And so he was the first one that came up with the idea, use this to destroy businesses and free enterprise. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I found that. But here's some other keys on that too. You know, Mikhail Gorbachev, you remember the last dictator of the Soviet Union? Do you know what he did right when he stepped down? He moved to San Francisco and he started Green Cross International, which is an environmental group. They realized that's the vehicle for world government. All the energies of the communist movement worldwide said, that's it. Because that's the only thing that has no borders, no boundaries. It's the whole world we have to protect, so it'll give us totalitarian control. It's a world problem that needs a world solution by a world government. And that's what they knew, that's it. And that's when they jumped into that and moved forward. But here's a few lies of that you need to know, because that movement is not going away. Whenever there is finally a world government totalitarian control, it will be the guise of implementing it will be the environmental movement. And it's crystal clear that's where it will come from. So we need to understand the facts on this so we can educate others, not to be sucked into something that sounds really good, but unfortunately it is not good. Here's the three flaws. The founding premise of the whole movement is CO2 is a pollutant, right? If you have a big carbon footprint, man, you're just a disaster. Well, but what do we learn about communists? It's always the opposite. They say CO2 is a pollutant. What is it? It's plant food. And we don't have near enough of it in the atmosphere. I mean, that's what's shocking. Once you dig in and study, you see, oh my goodness, it is a complete opposite lie. Right now we have 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If you get down to 150 parts per million, everything green dies. And the movement that calls himself the green movement is trying to cut the carbon dioxide levels when what's the optimum level of CO2? We know from greenhouse growers, it's 1,600 parts per million. So we're at 1/4 of the optimum level of CO2 for everything that is green. They call themselves the green movement when we should be trying to create more carbon dioxide. Our impact on this, if you study, is so minimal. It's just a few percent anyway. It's from the evaporation off the oceans and things. But if we could, it would be good. If we could double, triple, and quadruple the level of CO2, just like inside a greenhouse would be outside the greenhouse. When they quadruple CO2, plant growth efficiency almost goes up 100%. Pretty powerful. What does that mean? It means the tomato plant inside the greenhouse, if it has 1,600 parts per million, will produce almost twice as many tomatoes as the one outside the greenhouse. Same size plant. That's how much it loves CO2. It's fertilizer for everything that is green. And their movement is changing the world. So you go, why are they against carbon dioxide? Because everything productive we do creates it. And it's to enslave mankind is the only point of the modern environmental movement. And they've hijacked all the energies that could be doing good things, because there is good things to be done. Dr. Patrick Moore, have you ever heard that name? He's the co-founder of Greenpeace. So he cares about the environment. I flew up to his home in Vancouver, British Columbia, several years ago to talk to him. And I said, Dr. Moore, why did you leave the group that you started? And he told me this in his own home. He said, because the communists took it over. And I saw all they were trying to do is to destroy capitalism and create regulation so it would destroy productivity in the world and they could enslave mankind. And this guy's not a Christian or anything, but it bothered him. He goes, it's totally anti-human. And he goes, by the way, it's anti-environment too. He said, the very policies they're pushing are hurting the earth, not helping it. And I was like, wow, it was so powerful and he has an environmental group up there that's doing real things that are helpful, managing the forest in Canada and natural resources in a good way, where of course we're using them, we're thinning them, we're cutting them, we're replanting to keep them healthy and strong, because we need those trees, but they're a blessing. Anyway, but that's some of the lies. And so and then the overpopulation is the other second lie of that movement. When if you study demography, we are getting ready to enter a depopulation cycle that's never happened before in the world because people have rejected the blessings of children. And so we're heading into a demographic winter. So that's a lie. And then the warming. They make you fearful of warming. And on a hot day here, probably in July, you're like, oh, I don't want it to go up a degree or two. But the reality is this. If you go down to the equator, we're the hottest place on earth. I spent a summer down there once helping some missionaries, and you see something real quick where it's so hot, 100 degrees every day, 100% humidity. It's just, life loves warmth. The biodiversity of plants and animals is mind-boggling. They have hundreds of species of animals, plants, insects, birds that you don't even have here because it's too cold here. They can't survive here. It's really amazing. And then you go up to northern Canada or Alaska where it gets cold and you look and you go, there's only a few things that even can survive here, a few trees, a few animals. Life hates the cold. But they make us, again, they make us fearful of warming when cooling what's dangerous. And it's all a scheme. If we could raise the world's temperature a degree or two, which we cannot, or again, our actions just have no influence hardly at all. But if we could, it would be wonderful. You would have hundreds of millions of more acres you could farm in Canada and Russia if we would just go up a few degrees. Right now, the seasons aren't long enough to grow anything. But if we could do that, it would be great, but we can't. The homosexual movement, I started studying that. Because some of their goals were pushing that. And I found the first homosexual organization in America to start pushing that as normal and natural and healthy was called the Mattachine Society. And it was started by Henry Hay, who was one of the leaders in the Communist Party. And I thought, these people don't miss a trick. They see, because Satan is their commander-in-chief, what God intended man to do and what God intended man not to do. And they're going to make sure we're doing what we shouldn't do and not doing what we should do, because that's what Satan loves, death and destruction. But I saw that and I was like, oh my goodness, they don't miss a trick. You go into the feminist movement. What was the feminist movement? They act like it's for women's rights and all that stuff. The key book written was a book called Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And tens of millions of ladies back in the 60s and 70s, they read that book and they believed her lies that fulfillment was to be found out in the world working for some man, when they didn't realize, no, it was right there in your home with your family and your children. Do you know why they wanted women out of the home? Because they wanted her position, which is the most powerful position in the entire world. You're raising the next generation. They said, no, we want to... They wanted to raise the next generation. So, you go out, and what's so sad is tens of millions of people did follow her and her lies, and people found out later she was a staunch supporter of Joseph Stalin. So she was simply a communist doing her part for the revolution to destroy the family structure in America. Then you go on, this is kind of a touchy subject because everyone goes, well, I love that, but the rock and roll culture of the 60s and 70s, you have to understand how destructive that was. There's millions of our young people today in America in their graves because they followed those Pied Pipers into the drugs, sex, and rock and roll. and it created the rebellion. The communists wanted to use the rebellion of youth to rebel against their traditions, rebel against their parents, and they were hoping to harness that into the communist revolution. But even John Lennon himself, and people don't like to hear this, and I like the Beatles, whatever, he was a hardcore communist. He wrote the song for the communist revolution in America called Working Class Hero. And I read articles in the Soviet Union back in the early 70s where the Red Star and the papers there in Moscow were interviewing him. And he was talking about how he was doing his part to break down the morality, break down the culture. And he was disappointed. He goes, we've got to caught up a little bit too much in the drugs ourselves where we haven't been as effective as we should be. But it was like, no, that was purposeful. They wanted to destroy and rot us from within. And so we see that. A lot of people don't realize this too, that as they got that culture going through the 60s and into the early 70s, and the communists had penetrated most of the universities in America and totally into our government, hundreds of spies in our government we know now. And so they were hoping for that revolution because communists want a revolution, a literal violent revolution. And I was shocked when I was restudying this again, even though I was alive then, but the Students for a Democratic Society, the Weather Underground, two of the Marxist communist groups in America back then in the 60s, they tried for revolution. In 1971 into 1972, there was just an 18-month period. Guess, just think for yourself before I say the answer. Think in your mind how many bombings there might have been of buildings in America. I mean, in America, so we're not talking about somewhere else. How many buildings were blown up in America just in an 18-month period in 1971, 72? Think of a number, what would be high, like, because this is America. Like, that kind of thing doesn't happen. Oh, yes, it does. And this is Time Magazine, 1972. The FBI says over the 18-month period, there was 2,500 buildings blown up in America by the Weather Underground. That's 5 a day for a year and a half, every day. Police stations, buildings, city council buildings, whatever. They were creating the chaos because they were hoping, okay, we can get the revolution. It's just going to overflow into the streets. People are going to come out with their guns and just start killing each other. But they learned something. They learned there's too much Bible in this country. There's too much Christianity. These people, God said, thou shalt not kill. They're not going to do that. Yes. And so they realized what Antonio Gramsci had said back in the 1930s was true. Listen to this quote. This is what has happened to our country. But here's what happened. Any country grounded in Judeo-Christian values can't be overthrown until those roots are cut. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of the schools, universities, churches, and media. That's what we've lived through. And so all those 60s radicals that had tried for the Marxist revolution, what did they do? They jumped into our school system. Bill Ayers himself, who was one of the leaders of that, blowing up the 2,500 buildings, he went to the University of Chicago and became a professor to teach students the rest of his life. And he also worked on the committee that writes the curriculum for all of our government schools in America for over a decade. They knew what they were doing. They went into the seminaries in America back in the 1930s in earnest. They knew if we could capture the energies of the church and deflect them off to doing things that sound good, the social justice and all this stuff, then we're going to eliminate our enemy, but we're also going to be very successful. You saw just a couple months ago all the riots and things on our college campuses, right? Going on. Well, someone that was at one of those picked up a flyer and sent it to me because they knew I'd studied this and organized the Intifada. It was a hammer and sickle on it there. It says, a communist program for escalating the Gaza solidarity movement. It's a whole pamphlet put out by the Communist Party to give to all those college students, and it goes in detail in there. Okay, before the election this year in September and October, we got to ramp this up, violence in the streets, everything. We've got to burn this place down. But it's here, and I looked at the last page, and it says, oh, put out by the Revolutionary Communists of America. They don't miss a trick. If they see someone discontent, they'll use them, or they'll make someone discontent and use them. It's all about using other people. Some of the Chinese people here, I've met some of them in this area of the country, and I love their knowledge of this communism. But they lived through this with Mao's Cultural Revolution. We have gone through the same thing, but the reason it wasn't so violent is because we are still armed. But they've done the same thing he did. He removed the four olds: the old culture, old ideology, old customs, old traditions. Why? You erase the past so you can have a Bolshevik forever future where the kids don't know where they came from, they don't know what freedom looks like, and they believe the lies of the communist movement. And that is what over our whole lives, everyone in here. You've seen how much America has changed. That's why. We've been in the middle of a cultural revolution, and most of us thought, oh, it's going to be okay, it's America. Well, it's not going to be okay if we continue on the road that we're going down. So many things they've done over the years to have a plan, to be purposeful. If you look through the long march through the institutions that Antonio Gramsci talked about, you see they've done it. They've taken over education, entertainment, media, big business. Where do all the donations go from all those big businesses, free enterprise, big businesses supposedly? They got on the boards there. They worked their way into positions to use that money to make sure all the funding's going to their radical causes. They go wherever they can have the most influence. The foundations, the colleges, the churches, the government. The deep state, which people started talking about more when they saw how Washington, D.C. was coming unglued against Trump when he first got elected, people were like, that's weird. A president of the United States can't even have a conversation with his intelligence community without it being on the cover of the New York Times the next day. And people realized something's powerful in Washington, D.C. And then they started to realize, oh, that's the thing called the deep state. Well, I've studied this. As you study it, the deep state is the communist movement that has embedded themselves since the 1930s in Washington, D.C. And Whittaker Chambers, the guy that came out, I talked about at the beginning, he was one of those people. And we know now there was hundreds of Soviet spies in FDR's administration. Hundreds have been documented through declassified documents. So that's why Washington, D.C. has always been against us. It's always been against America. It's always been, is our State Department always working against the interests of the United States throughout the world for the last 100 years? Well, that's why. But they had a goal. And again, like the Bible tells us, in this spiritual battle, we need to stand up against the evil. We need to put the full armor on. We need to be ready to engage this battle because they are moving forward. They are committed. And if there's no one standing in front of them saying, no, you will not teach that to the children, or no, that's not acceptable, and that's a lie what you're pushing. If we don't expel the lies, then, like the old saying goes, every story sounds true till you hear the other side. And if our children don't hear the other side, they'll believe the lies, and they'll be useful idiots. That's what Lenin called them. They'll be pulled into this movement that will destroy them. It's all about destruction. It's not ever about building anything up, making things better. It's about using the good nature of people, the people that, I want to make a difference, using their energies to destroy and enslave who's left. And we look at communist China today, we see the future for the world. John D. Rockefeller in 1973 wrote an op-ed for the New York Times after having just gone over there and seen what Mao had done. And Mao is estimated to have killed between 60 and 80 million of his own people. And what did David Rockefeller say about that when he came back to America? You can still read that editorial online, it's still there. He said, whatever Mao had to do to create what he has, it was worth it. I'm telling you, that's what these people that are following Satan think. You have to liquidate 70 million people to create control, no problem. That's why we value life. Jesus gives you life and he gives you it more abundantly. We are to stand for life. They are about death and nothing else. And they sell what they're selling with lies, just like Satan does. Any temptation any of you have, Satan is selling it to you as it's going to be good for you or it's going to satisfy you. And it's a lie. You know that. So when you fall into it, you should realize, what am I doing? You know, he puts the poison inside a chocolate bar, so when you see it, you're like, ooh, that looks good. But God was so kind in his word to tell us, sweetie, don't eat that chocolate. It has poison in it. You shall surely die. I want to encourage you. It's the same thing on a personal level as a big level. We have to stand for the truth. We have to expel the lies. That's why we need to understand what's going on. It's so vital that we do. They had goals. I'm going to read a couple of them because it shows, and then I'll wrap up here. But they had goals. Some of you might not be aware of these. 45 current communist goals from the 1950s. Showing again, they had a plan. This is the Communist Party USA from the 1950s. But I'm going to read a couple of them that when I first read them, I was shocked because I thought, why do the communists understand that if you turn away from the Bible, you will be destroyed? But we don't see that most of the time. Here's what their goals were. Goal number 24, eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. Isn't that crazy? You're like, they know if people start talking obscene, it's going to eventually collapse on itself. So then, like Lenin said, we're not going to need to fire a shot. They're just going to fall like a ripe fruit. Isn't that amazing? Quick story, because it's so important. I know all of you know we've changed a lot, but here's a quick story from my life that shows it's more than you think it has been. It was probably 72 or 73. I was probably 7 or 8 years old. I went to the store with my mother. She was going to buy some ladies' undergarments or something, and back then a little boy would never have been allowed into a woman's department, so I had to wait outside on the sidewalk. I'm standing outside the store waiting for her, and on the other side of the doorway, there was a really rough character. He was tattooed head to toe, which back then was not normal at all. I mean, it was unheard of. I remember I'd never seen someone with tattoos before, and he was just covered. So he was talking to a guy next to him. And while he was talking to him, he used the word hell. And a few minutes went by, and then all of a sudden, I remember when he looked over and he saw me, and I remember when his eyes connected with mine, and I remember because of this, I was scared. I didn't know what was going to happen. He walks over to me. He puts his face right in my face, and here's what he said. Son, I'm so sorry for saying that. I didn't see you standing there. Do you understand how much we've changed? He knew you don't talk like that in front of a child. It's like we don't have any rules anymore, any restrictions. Ladies talk just as foul as guys do. It's like there's no shame in anything. We can't buy into that. You have to be sparkling different if you're a follower of Christ. You have to be. That's how the world sees he is real in the example of our life. But I remember that story, and I just go, wow, we have just drifted 1,000,000 miles. They also said back then, break down the cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Isn't that amazing? In the 50s, they knew if we can get pornography out there, this thing will implode. But most Americans don't get that. They're like, what's wrong with that? People should be able to do whatever they want to do. That's a total lie of the devil. People were never free in America, ever, to do what is wrong. We got the freedoms that we have from our founders so we'd be free only to do what is right. No man's free to do what is wrong, whether the law allows it or not, because there is a God. And you will stand before him one day and give an account. And so for us to allow them to spew these lies, freedom is doing whatever you want. No, freedom is doing what God would have you to do and nothing else ever. And we've drifted from a culture that upheld that, had laws that said, no, you can't distribute pornography in this country. You'll go to prison. And now we live in a pornographic society. That was purposeful, though. It was Satan's disciples, the communists, knowing we're going to rot this thing from the inside out. All right, last thing here. Remember at the beginning I talked about how we're losing this battle because they are more committed than we are. Okay? I'm going to read you something. It's a letter from a young man who went down to Mexico for the summer with his college once, and he became a communist. And it's a letter he wrote back to his fiancée. And he's telling her, I cannot marry you anymore because I found a new love. And I'm just telling you, as I read this, every time I read it, it really convicts me. Because I always think, am I as committed to the truth, to Jesus Christ, as these people are to a total and complete lie? But listen to this and see if you are as committed as you should be. I'm hoping this will encourage you to be more committed, to follow the Lord, to be different, to be the light, to be the salt, and to be unashamed, because you have what the world is looking for, whether they know it or not. Here's what he said. We communists have a philosophy of life which no amount of money could buy. We have a cause to fight for, a definitive purpose in life. We subordinate our petty personal selves into a great movement of humanity. And if our personal lives seem hard or our egos appear to suffer through subordination to the party, then we are adequately compensated by the thought that each of us, in a small way, is contributing to something new and true and better for mankind, the struggle for world communism. There is one thing in which I am dead earnest, and that is the communist cause. It is my life, my business, my religion, my hobby, my sweetheart, my wife and mistress, my bread and meat. I work at it in the daytime and I dream of it at night. Its hold on me grows, not lessens, as time goes on. Therefore, I cannot carry on a friendship, a love affair, or even a conversation without relating to this force which both drives and guides my life. I evaluate people, books, ideas, and actions according to how they affect the communist cause and by their attitudes towards it. I've already been in jail because of my ideas, and if necessary, I'm ready to go before a firing squad. If we had a fraction of that for Jesus Christ, I think a lot of our problems would kind of vaporize real quickly. We have forgotten God. That's why everything that's happening in our country is happening. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a famous dissident from the Soviet Union, he was, his whole life he spent in the gulags of the Soviet Union, but he would slip out his writings, and they came to America, and we started to realize for the first time what it was like to live in a totalitarian, communist-controlled country. Well, finally, amazingly, he was released in the 70s, and he was able to come to America. Somehow our government put enough pressure on them, and he came to America, and all the reporters were around him, all the people there, and they said, and he was such a gifted, articulate person, they said, what happened to Russia? How did you fall to communism? And I thought, when I first heard the question, I thought, there's a million things he can say there, right? I mean, just, he can go on for an hour talking about, here's all he said. All the mics were there. He said, we forgot God. That's all it takes. You will end in communism if you forget God. We have to remember him. We have to keep his commandments. We have to live a life living the truth, standing for the truth, and sharing the truth with others, because it is what the world is looking for. It's what every communist is looking for. Whittaker Chambers, when he finally came out of the Communist Party, he said, I finally realized Jesus is what I had been looking for in the Communist Party. I wanted purpose. So I encourage you, put on the full armor. The musicians can come up now. They need to, and then I'll talk about this. Okay. But put on the full armor so you're ready to engage this battle. Understand the times. My son just gave me that, and I forgot to mention some of this last service. What I do each week with my son-in-law, we have something called Agenda Weekly. And we go through all the news of the week, because as we've traveled this country for 15 years, we realize even a lot of the people that care about this country, they're awake, they don't really know what's going on because there's so many conflicting messages coming at us in the media. So we go through all that each week and consolidate it into here's the key news items, here's prayer and action items, and then I make a video on a specific topic of something you need to understand, and we send it out every Friday night. And we do that. The blessing of it, we're hoping will be a blessing, is to save you time. Turn off the dumb TV and do something with your time. We give it there where it's just boiled down. Here's the bullet points so you understand what's going on. Now go use your time wisely. Go ask your neighbor out to lunch and share the gospel. Go become involved in some of the activities the church is doing in the community. To turn the TVs off. And so anyway, it's something you can sign up for. It's what funds us and what we do. It's $5 a month. It's something that we've done and we do it full time. But it's so many people, and I even had several come up after the first service, people that get it here, and they were like, it's such a blessing, which we're so grateful for. That was our point, is to try to encourage Christians to use their time wisely. You only have so much time left on this earth, and you're going to give an account. Use it for him. You'll be so glad that you did, and we're trying to encourage that. We also have our books and videos and things back there, and I think the pastor has a free copy of some of the videos for you, but we also have some other resources there if you're interested. But that helps fund us, but I hopefully and prayerfully will be a great blessing to you. And so anyway, that's something to consider out there. In closing, pray, prepare, separate, and share. We're in a sobering time in our country. You need to be on your knees. God, what would you have me to do? Please direct my path. Give me wisdom, give me discernment so I'm not deceived by lies. We need to prepare. I think some rough days are ahead. I'm not trying to be a gloom and doom. When you mark 2 points on a line and you draw a line, you see where you're going. If we don't turn, we're going to get to where we're going, and it's a nightmare. And so we need to pray that God will use us to stand in the gap, to speak the truth, because the gospel is the answer for what we're dealing with. And it's the only answer. That's the only alternative to communism is Jesus Christ and Christianity. And so the more people we turn to him and being renewed and regenerated by him, the better chance we have of turning the world away from the self-destructive, suicidal course that it is on. And then we need to separate out and be different, and we need to share the truth with others. You have to get good at doing that. Ray Comfort has some great materials to help encourage you to faithfully tell others about the good news of the Bible. But I'm so thankful for your pastor. Do you like your pastor at all? I'm sorry, I always got to do that because I love how you love your pastor. You should love your pastor, but it's encouraging to me. Not everyone has what you have here. Take advantage of it. But you work it individually, being the salt and the light to change this world for Jesus Christ. Thank you.